Hey, good evening, everybody. Let me know if you can hear me well. I don't see anybody's. Hold on. How's everybody doing? Hope you all had a wonderful holiday weekend um, for Christmas as we get ready to roll into the new year. Good evening, Latifa. Good evening, Miss Lorna. Thank you so much for letting me know that the sound is good. I hope you all can see me well. I didn't turn the other light on, so it's a little bit dark. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tifa. So we're going to good evening, Prophetess Reese. I hope everybody had an amazing holiday weekend, that everybody is healthy and safe. Today, I know y'all had a little bit of a break from walking through the Bible, but we're back and in full effect. Hey, Eric and Trina. I love that. I like the new together, the together page. I see y'all from YouTube. So today we're going to talk about Esther, chapters 1 through 5. A lot of you may know the story. We always hear chapter 4, verse 14 quoted, right? Talking about how do you not know if you were created for such a time as this. Basically, Mordecai telling Esther something that we're going to get to in a minute. So I'm going to just jump right in. I know it's around dinner time, but thank you all for coming in. Make sure y'all share. Let everybody know that we're back on and in full effect. So, Esther chapter 1, right, is talking about how Queen Vashti, who was King, how do you pronounce his name? Ahasuerus's wife, okay, she was dethroned, all right. And so, a little bit background. Let's go into a little bit of background. So the book of Esther is talking about the great deliverance of the Jews, right, from extermination during the time of Babylonian captivity. So one of the purposes of the book was to show us, by whom and how the great deliverance of the Jews in all the lands came about, and to record the institution of the Feast of Purim, and to reveal the historical background of the liberator of the Jews from captivity, who was King Cyrus. Now, King Cyrus, as you guys know, he was mentioned when the first part of Ezra was covered, and then shortly after, Esther, the second half of Ezra is covered. But he was the one that, ultimately liberated the Jews. Now, Esther played a part in a piece of liberation as well, right? So during this time, King, how do you say his name again? King Ahasuerus was he was basically one of the ruling entities of this time. He had about 127 provinces that he was ruler over. So he was kind of one of the my brother, hey, good evening. So he was the main man at this time, okay? So people feared him, but he was a king. So he had Queen Vashti was his wife, and if you go down into Esther chapter 1, right, he puts out a decree, a law, right? Well, basically he asks his wife to come do something. Good evening, Apostle. God bless you all. So he asks his wife to come before him, right? And she decides that she doesn't want to do it. She's like, nah, I'm not going to do that. And so he basically, King Ahasuerus asked, right, to bring Queen Vashti before him, for her to wear her royal crown so that she could show her beauty to the people, the officials, because the Bible talks about how she was beautiful. But she refused, right, to come at the king's command that was sent by his eunuchs. And so this made the king furious, that his anger burned within him. So what I love about this in Esther, we're going to see in a couple of the chapters that I cover, how it talks about how anger, right, and what anger can do to us, and how we need to be cautious with our anger. So anyway, he was furious with anger, and so then his guys, his right hand men, start telling him, hey, you're the king. You should do something about this, because we don't want all the other women in the rest of the land to think that this behavior is okay. She's the queen, she's influential, And we don't want women thinking that they should be disrespecting their husbands if your wife, the queen, is disrespecting you. So they were like, we don't want the queen's behavior to become known, throughout the land. So they'll wind up despising their husbands. And the king wasn't feeling that, right? So he commanded Vashti to be brought to him again, and she declined. So then you had another one of the king's men that said, listen, put out a decree saying that that the men should be kings in their home. I don't want to misquote this. So he says, it's Mamuk, I don't know how to pronounce these names either. Mamukin asked the king to make a royal decree, right, proclaiming that that men shall be master in their own house, and they should give Vashti, that he should give Queen Vashti's royal position to another beautiful woman. So the king entertains it, and he's like, you know what, let's do that. So we roll right into Esther chapter 2. So this is the part where this is the chapter that Esther becomes queen. Okay. So after the king, his anger, his wrath subsides, right? He begins to remember what Vashti did. So again, one of his servants was like, hey, why don't you just rally up a bunch of virgins, and let's prepare them for you and find another wife that way, find someone else to crown as queen. So the king obliges. They round up a whole bunch of virgins. They begin to prepare them with perfumes, and it's a 12-month process that they go through of beautification. And then once the 12 months is up, they're able to go to the king. And so what the process looks like, let me say this real quick. So in this one is also where Mordecai and Esther are introduced into the story. So it gives a little bit of background on the two. It talks about how Mordecai raised Esther. Esther was an orphan. Both of her parents had died. And Esther was the daughter of Mordecai's uncle. So Mordecai takes her in and raises her as his own daughter. So Esther, if you read the story already, you will see that she has a lot of respect for him. Even though she becomes queen, he still gives her certain directives in the story, and she obeys him. So all right. So all the virgins go through this beautification process. There's 6 months of going through oil and myrrh, and then 6 months of like being beautified with perfume and stuff like that. Okay, so Esther, right? She winds up, it's her turn, right? After her 12-month process. And so a little bit about the process is that these virgins, they're taken into the king, they're taken to the king. Um, he does what he does with them, and then they leave in the morning, and then they may not ever see the king again. They are sent to the man that's over the concubines. So basically they become concubines. The king may call for them again by name, and he may not. So here it comes, it's Esther's turn to go to the king. So she was taken to him, right? And she was loved more than all the other women, right? Chapter 2 tells us that she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. All right. So, a lot of people talk about Esther, about this book. A lot of people quote this book, and when talking about women and the important part that they can play, and how God used women consistently throughout the Bible. So Mordecai, chapter 2 ends with Mordecai discovering a plot. There were two gatekeepers that wanted to lay hands on the king, and not in the good way. So Mordecai went and told Esther about it. Esther went and talked to the king, and then the king wound up having them. He took care of the two guys. And so in chapter 3, we roll right into chapter 3, and he once he kills the two gatekeepers, he goes, and this is when Haman is introduced into the story. So Haman is promoted, right? it gives a little bit of background on who his parents are, and he's even advanced, right, and set his seat above all. This is Haman was advanced, and he was set above all the princes who were with him. Okay, and all the king's servants who within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman. Okay, so for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage to Haman. So this caused Haman to be enraged. And another thing about the story of Esther, if you look, if you really dig into it, you can also begin to see a type and shadow of Christ, and even the story of how, how the enemy fell. Scripture talks about how Jesus said, I saw Satan fall like lightning, right? And so you can kind of see a little bit of this here, where Haman was set above all the other princes. And we know that the enemy, when he was he was over worship, and this has already been talked about, how he had an important role until pride got him, right, and he was kicked out of heaven. There was a war, and then he was kicked out of heaven. So as we go through just these 5 chapters, you can begin to see a little bit of a similar pattern with Haman and his anger and his pride. So um, so again, Haman was upset because Mordecai wasn't bowing to him. Mordecai tells him, well, I'm a Jew. So, and if you don't know anything about that, the Jews, they respected God. The majority of them like only bowed to God. And so Mordecai, he wasn't having that. And also, bowing is also a form of respect. So maybe Mordecai didn't have any respect for Haman. Who knows? It doesn't go into that. All it says was that Mordecai would say that he was a Jew, so he wasn't gonna bow. All right, so that caused Haman to get upset. Haman went to King Ahasuerus complaining about it. And he was telling the king that, listen, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among us, and their laws are different than ours, so they won't keep the king's laws. So it's not fitting for them. It's not fitting for the king to let them remain amongst us. So Haman is the king's right hand man. So the king hears him out and is like, okay, you know what? I hear you. Let's. Haman is like, let's write a decree, to destroy them. So as you read on, the king took his signet from his hand, gave it to Haman. And then Haman goes and does his own thing. All right. The king gives him the money and the people, and he tells Haman to do what seems to be good to you. All right. So the king's scribes were called upon. The decree is written according to everything that Haman commanded. And then we roll into chapter 4. Okay. And this is one of the best chapters in the part that I have. I love chapter 4. Again, a lot of it is usually quoted, but this is when Mordecai finds out what Haman is doing. And Mordecai is distressed. He starts, he's hurting. He's like, oh my gosh, we're all going to be killed. So he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and then he went out into the city. He cried out, and then he goes and sends someone to tell Esther what's going on. Esther winds up sending her eunuch, um, winds up sending somebody back to Mordecai, right, to with garments so that he can remove his sackcloth and ashes. And if you guys don't know what that means, basically when people put on sackcloth in the Bible, it was a form of showing that you were openly mourning, right? Um, so wearing sackcloth and ashes was to publicly express your sorrow or mourning or regret, right? It could have been for maybe you did do something right wrong, or it could have been just mourning. In this case, we know that Mordecai was distressed and mourning for his people, or what was, he was expressing sorrow for what Haman wanted to do. So Queen Esther has sent him new garments, but he refused to put them on because, again, he was grieved. He was distressed and sorrowful. So then they go on and uh, So Esther's like, okay, well, what's really going on? And then Mordecai sends back and tells her, sends her back a copy of the decree of what Haman was doing. So she comes out and she's like, I can't go back to the king. So once the king, once the virgins will go through their beautification process, like I said, after 12 months, they will go and get their time with the king. And again, I said they may never see the king again unless he calls for them by name. So Esther knew this, and she told Mordecai, hey, listen, I've already had my time with the king. He has not called for me by name. What the rule is, that if he hasn't called for you by name and I go to him, he might kill me, because that was what the law was written, that if you go before the king and he had not called you, you would be put to death. So this is when the bomb scripture, right, the one that a lot of people quote, was written, and it starts off in chapter 4, verse 13, and Mordecai, 14. And then Mordecai tells her, well, if you remain completely silent at this time, right, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Okay, and I kind of want to pause there real quick, because again, we hear that scripture quoted a lot. How do we know if you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? But the part is also where he tells her, if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. And that I just love that reminder in the word, in that, listen, we got to do what God is calling us to do. Even if it seems hard, we have to trust him. We have to trust in his word. We have to do what he calls us to do, even if we can't see the end side of it, even if we don't know what the outcome may be. We may think that the outcome is death for us, but we got to be okay with that, in the sense of, um, we got to obey God, right? And a lot of times, being in the kingdom, being a man or woman of God, requires lots of death. And I'm not talking about just physical death. I'm talking about death to the flesh, death to self, right? It requires selflessness and not selfishness. And that's what I love about this story, is that it is clear about selflessness, and how even Mordecai and Esther were selfless, and how, how the outcome of the story, we know, some of us may know how amazing it is. And even to see how Haman was selfish. And we'll see, and when teacher Liz covers her part of Esther, we'll see what Haman's outcome is because of his selfishness and pride. But anyway, so Mordecai tells her that. So Esther comes and she says, you know what? Gather all the Jews, right? And I need you guys to fast for me, neither eat or drink for 3 days or nights, right? And she said, my maids and I will fast likewise. I'll go to the king, which is against the law, but if I perish, I perish. Okay. Mordecai went his way and did according to what Esther commanded him. And what I love about this story too is how there is so much mutual respect, right? And I'm going to get out of you guys' faces in a few minutes, because I'm already at 18 minutes. But mutual respect. Okay, she was the queen, he was the man. Even though he was her cousin, he raised her, she respected him and listened to him and valued his wisdom and his counsel, even though she was queen. But he still also respected her as queen. So I love how it even shows how we should respect each other within the kingdom. So they go and fast. Now another thing about this story is, look, we're getting ready to go into a 3-day fast with KO. I know Apostle talked about it starting on January 2nd. Listen, if you're on here and you don't know about fasting, this story tells us the power of fasting. And there are plenty of stories in the Bible that talk about different types of fasts. But this 3-day fast, I think it was so timely how God structured walking through the Bible, and when Apostle called us to do this upcoming fast. Because look, Esther talks about a 3-day fast, and how they fasted for 3 days, a corporate fast. They fasted corporately for 3 days, and a whole people were delivered. So listen, if you don't know, the power of fasting and prayer. Just look at Esther's story. Your prayer, your coming together to fast corporately. Listen, the scripture tells us one can put 1,000 to flight and two 10,000. So we're gonna be putting thousands of things to flight during this upcoming fast, and we don't know who in our family line or who connected to KO or who is going to be liberated because of coming together corporately. So, all right, getting out your hair real quick. Chapter 5, it talks about Esther's banquet. Basically, is going just basically talks about how Esther. Okay, so she does what she told Mordecai she was going to do after the fast. She goes before the king. There is a process for it where you go to the court, and if the king will see you, and if he raises his golden scepter, then that says he approves of you, being there, and you can come and meet with him, which he, again, remember, he had favor. Esther had favor and grace. He loved her. So when she went there, he raised the scepter. She was allowed to talk to him. He asked her, what is it that you like? I give you up to half the kingdom. And this girl was wise. She said, look, I just want to hold the banquet, and I want you and Haman to be there. So he said, okay, I'll do it. So they get the banquet together. So this joker, Haman, okay, and I'll leave y'all with this. Scripture talks about this. He's a prime example of Proverbs 16, okay? He is a prime example of Proverbs 16 and 18, where it says, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. This joker begins to, we already know he didn't like Mordecai because Mordecai wouldn't bow to him. So he begins plotting over Mordecai. But during the banquet, this fool starts going and bragging about he brags to his family about everything the king has done. And he's like, oh, look, Queen Esther even called for me by name. She didn't call for nobody else, but she called for me to be at the banquet. And this joker don't even know what's about to go down, that Proverbs 16:18 is about to be made manifest in his life because his prideful tale. But so that's how chapter 5 kind of ends off, setting up the banquet. Then Haman, like I said, he goes and he begins to plot to hang Mordecai. He goes and gets the gallows made, because he's thinking that when he goes the next day to the banquet, that he's going to make a spectacle of Mordecai and calls him to be hung, because remember, he's boasting about how he's the greatest in the land and how much the king loves him and how much Queen Esther, how she called him out. So this is an amazing story. If you want to see how it goes, tune in tomorrow to get the rest of the book of Esther. I hope you guys have a blessed week. Enjoy your new year. I'll see some of you guys for the New Year service, and even some of you guys for prayer on the 29th. I love you all. Y'all have a blessed evening, and I'll probably see some of y'all for discipleship here in about another hour and a half. God bless you all, and take care.